Rufus Hackney throttled the bush hog down through the last rank of standing hay, boots braced against the deck plate, left hand riding the wheel, while the right stayed low against his thigh, out of habit more than need. The blades chewed a clean green swath behind him. 40 yards out the grass began to lie flat in a widening circle that had nothing to do with his mower, and the sound reached him a half-second after the sight did, a low hammering thud that climbed into something that filled the whole valley floor. He did not look up right away. He looked toward the ridge first, one hand leaving the wheel to touch the flat shape folded inside his shirt pocket, the way another man might check a watch. Why he did that, before anyone had told him a single soul was missing on that mountain, was not a thing he could have explained to the woman now leaning out of the aircraft's open door, cupping a gloved hand to her mouth. "Sir, you need to clear this field. This is a restricted search perimeter." The Black Hawk sat down 40 yards off, rotor wash flattening a fresh circle into hay Rufus had not yet cut, dust and chaff boiling up off the dry margin at the field's edge. Chief Warrant Officer 3, Kira Sedgwick, had her helmet visor up, jaw set, one hand still on the collective as the aircraft settled its full weight onto struts that sank an inch into ground, softer than her charts had promised. She had flown the approach clean through a valley haze that had no business being called visual conditions, held a hover over unfamiliar high ground, and set 5 tons of airframe down inside a horse pasture without clipping a fence post, competence that had nothing to do with what she said next. Rufus throttled the bush hog to idle. He did not shout back. He climbed down, favoring his left shoulder as it stiffened past waist height and would not lift the rest of the way, and walked toward the aircraft with the particular unhurried economy of a man who has never once in his life needed to arrive somewhere fast to arrive on time. "This is my hay ground," he said, plain, not loud. "Been mine 60 years. Sedgwick had already turned half away, waving a hand at the tail number as if the size of the aircraft settled the argument on its own. "Then you'll want to be somewhere else on it. We've got 3 hikers overdue up that ridgeline and a closing weather window, and I don't have time to log a bystander." She said it the way a woman says something she has said a dozen times to a dozen men who did not belong where they were standing, never once wondering whether this might be the one time the ground underneath her had a name older than her flight orders. If you've ever trusted a map more than the person who walked the ground it was drawn from, you already know how this ends. Rufus did not argue. He looked past her shoulder at the ridge, at the notch in it only he seemed to be reading, and said nothing more, which was itself an answer nobody in that cabin was equipped yet to hear. He was, by most measures, an easy man to walk past. The barn coat had gone the color of standing water at the shoulders, canvas worn thin and correct rather than for show, a chambray shirt beneath it, soft from washing until the collar had lost its stiffness years ago. His left shoulder would not rise past the height of his own chest, a legacy of a fall nobody at the aircraft had asked about, and nobody would, and so he had long since stopped reaching for things overhead and started turning his whole body instead, torso swinging like a gate whenever he needed to point at something on the horizon rather than lift an arm to it. In the shirt pocket over his heart rode a folded square of onion-skin paper gone the color of weak tea, its creases worn soft as cloth from 40 years of opening and closing along the same 8 lines. He touched it the way another man touches a rosary or a coin he carries for luck, not for luck, but because the map inside it was the only version of that ridge he trusted to still be telling the truth. Rufus checked the sun's position against the barn roof out of pure habit, the way he had every evening of married life, gauging how much daylight stood between him and supper. 54 years he had been doing that particular arithmetic. Estelle Hackney would already have the porch light burning by the time he came in off this field, whether he was 20 minutes late or 2 hours. She had never once let it go dark on him, not through droughts, not through the year the barn burned, not through anything, and he had never once come home to a house that didn't have that one bulb waiting yellow over the door, like a small standing promise. It was not romance anymore, hadn't been in decades. It was a fact of the household, as fixed as the well pump or the mailbox, and he loved her the exact same amount it took to keep a fact like that true for half a century. None of that showed on him standing in a trampled hayfield, being told to clear off his own dirt. A crew chief in the cabin doorway, headset still cupped over one ear, glanced at the old man's boots and back at his kneeboard, as if cataloging him for a report nobody had asked for yet. "Got an ID on him?" the crew chief said to no one in particular, and a second crewman answered without looking up from a tablet-free clipboard of his own. "Landowner complaint, probably. We'll flag it after." Rufus heard both remarks and filed them the way he filed weather. Noted, not argued with. He had spent 23 years being the man other men wrote reports about after the fact, and he had learned long before any of these three were born that being underestimated cost him nothing so long as the ground itself still knew who he was. Inside the cabin, laid over a knee-mounted screen, the terrain-following display glowed with a search grid stitched from satellite relief and a county survey layer, green contour lines marching up toward the ridge in tidy, confident bands. Sedgwick tapped 2 fingers against the printed run sheet, clipped to her kneeboard rather than the screen itself. Old habit from a unit that still liked paper in hand when the weather turned foul, and said, without looking at Rufus, "Per the survey, the creek drainage runs straight up this fold, here, all the way to the saddle. That's our primary search leg." She had flown that haze-choked approach 11 minutes earlier with nothing but instruments and nerve, had called her altitudes calm as still water while her co-pilot's hands went white on the cyclic, and there was no dishonesty in her confidence now, only the plain fact that everything she knew from a screen, and the screen had never once been wrong for her before. "That crick doesn't run straight," Rufus said. "Kinks hard east around the old slide, halfway up, has for 30 years. Sedgwick did not even turn her head. "Sir, I appreciate you know this land, but that terrain model's built off a county survey, flown with laser resolution finer than any eyeball's ever going to manage, cross-checked against 3 passes of our own sensor data an hour ago. I don't have a credential on file for you, and I've got a 5-hour weather window to find 3 people before it closes. I can't divert search assets on somebody's memory." "Copy that," the crew chief said from the doorway, already logging something on his own clipboard, and the second crewman added, not unkindly, but not gently either, "Sir, you'll want to stand clear of the tail rotor if you're staying." 2 dismissals inside of a minute, stacked neat as fence posts, and Rufus took both the way he took most things now, without argument, without heat, his eyes still on the ridge, and not on any of the 3 people talking past him. He stepped back from the rotor arc as told, hands loose at his sides, and watched the crew bend back over their screen the way men bend over a fire they trust to keep them warm. He did not leave the field. He stood at its edge, boots planted in cut hay, and let them work, because somewhere behind Sedgwick's confident green contour lines was a fold in the ground that had never once, in 30 years, run the way her survey said it did, and 3 people's lives now depended on whether anyone in that cabin thought to ask a stooped old farmer why he kept looking at the mountain instead of the machine. The grid glowed blue and green across the projected display, a tidy rectangle of search boxes stacked up the slope like a quilt someone had cut too fast. Rufus stood at the cabin's open door, uninvited, watching the pattern crawl toward a saddle in the ridge that the map called a straight run of drainage. He said only one sentence, pitched low enough that Sedgwick had to lean half a step to catch it over the idling turbine. "Creek kinks east around the slide. Grid's a 1/4 mile short." Sedgwick did not look up from the screen. "We've run this twice already, sir." Flat, not cruel, the tone of a woman repeating an answer she considers settled business. The crew chief exchanged a glance with the second crewman that said nothing needed saying. But Jared Millwood, 24 years old and 6 weeks into this unit, had been watching the old man's face instead of the screen, and he noticed the thing nobody else in that cabin had thought to notice. Rufus wasn't guessing. He said it the same flat way a man reads out a phone number he has known by heart for decades, and his eyes never once flicked toward the display to check himself against it. Rufus marked the true line of the creek from memory, tracing it in pencil across a printed run sheet clipped to a fresh kneeboard, 5 careful strokes that swung east at the exact latitude he named aloud without checking a single number. Sedgwick radioed the divert as a courtesy, more to close the argument than to test it. The aircraft came low along his marked line at 110 feet, slow enough for the terrain-following radar to paint a full return, and the return matched him to within 30 yards, a kink in the ground, exactly where his pencil said it would be, exactly where her satellite survey insisted, flatly, that no kink existed. Nobody in the cabin said anything for 11 full seconds. Millwood was the one who finally broke it, quiet, almost to himself. He didn't even look at the screen. Sedgwick set the radio down without keying it, chest tight in a way she did not have a checklist for, chart data on one side and a stooped man's pencil line on the other, both now agreeing with the ground and disagreeing with the very survey her whole modernization program had been built to trust. She read the returning data twice before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice had none of the certainty it carried 40 minutes earlier standing in the hayfield. Protocol required a second independent confirmation before any search asset could be diverted off a filed grid, and no amount of pencil accuracy changed that line in the regulation. Sedgwick radioed it in anyway. Watched the request stall in a queue behind 2 other units, working 2 other slopes, and watched the clock above the cabin door eat a full search cycle, 40 minutes gone, to procedure, while the weather front on the western horizon, thickened by degrees, nobody could yet put a number to. It was Millwood who found the second problem, half by accident, cross-referencing the county survey's file date against the resort lease filing stapled behind it in the unit's shared terrain database, a filing 6 months old, attached to an option on the very slope the creek kinked around, the exact ground her flawed data called stable. The surveyor of record was the same firm retained by the leasing consultant, pushing that option through an unrelated zoning vote 5 days out. A smoothed contour, a missing slide line, a piece of unstable ground quietly certified buildable, the kind of correction that made a slope look safer on paper than it had any right to look underfoot. Sedgwick felt the floor of her own confidence give a half-inch. The particular vertigo of learning her instruments had not lied to her so much as been fed a lie to carry. Using Rufus's pencil line on the official record now meant admitting the terrain database her whole decommissioning review was built to replace human judgment with had been quietly compromised for money, and that admission would not stay confined to one afternoon's search. It would follow her program straight into the board vote 5 days out. She looked at Rufus standing at the cabin door, hands loose, saying nothing, and for the first time all afternoon did not have an answer ready. Colonel Weston Fairbanks arrived on the second aircraft 40 minutes later, and he did not wait for the rotors to spool down before he crossed the flattened hay at a pace that made the whole crew straighten without being told to. He was 61, silver at the temples under his flight cap, a man whose presence rearranged a room before he opened his mouth in it. He walked past Sedgwick without a word, past Millwood, past the crew chief still holding a headset, straight to where Rufus stood at the field's edge, with his hand resting near his shirt pocket. Fairbanks stopped in front of him. He took off his flight cap, turned it once in his hands, and set it down on the hood of the parked utility truck between them, not on his own head again, not offered to anyone, just set down, deliberate, the gesture of a man putting aside rank before he says a thing that has nothing to do with rank. He did not say it's an honor. He did not say anything for 4 full seconds, long enough that Sedgwick, 20 feet off, stopped moving entirely. "You still carry that map," Fairbanks said finally. Not a question. Rufus's hand had already found the shirt pocket without seeming to move there. "Some of it," he said. 41 years, Fairbanks said, and something in the steadiness of his voice cost him more to hold than a raised one would have. "I was 20. Whiteout came in over that same saddle during a training rotation, and I went down half a mile from where your creek kinks east, both legs no good under me, snow coming sideways hard enough I couldn't find up from down." He looked past Rufus, up at the ridge itself, as though the mountain might confirm it for him. "Chief Warrant Officer Hackney walked out to me on foot because no aircraft could fly in that ceiling, found me by dead reckoning off a map nobody else trusted, and carried me 2 miles down grade on his own back. I have tried 3 times since to get him to accept a citation for it. He has turned down every one." The chorus around them had gone entirely silent, the kind of silence that isn't empty so much as full of 11 seconds nobody wanted to be the one to end. Millwood stood with his headset forgotten in one hand. The crew chief had stopped writing anything at all. Sedgwick's mouth had opened slightly and produced no words, her own certainty from an hour earlier standing now in the open air beside her, like something she'd left the door unlocked on. "I requested this valley," Fairbanks said, "and I requested this man, by name, the moment I heard 3 hikers were overdue on this ridge. I did not tell your crew why. I wanted you to find out the way I did." He turned then, finally, to Sedgwick. "The way he read that creek an hour ago is the same way he found me in a whiteout with nothing but memory to steer by. Your radar confirmed him. It did not correct him. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference this review of yours is supposed to be settling." Rufus said nothing to any of it. He looked at the cap resting on the truck hood, at the ridge behind Fairbanks's shoulder, and touched his shirt pocket once more, the old habit outlasting even this. The falsified survey came apart within the hour, laid bare against Rufus's pencil line and the aircraft's own confirmed returns, and the search corrected to his corrected route, with daylight thinning fast along the ridgeline. The 3 hikers were found a little after 5, huddled in a rock hollow not 40 yards off the kink in the creek bed, exactly where Rufus said the ground would fold, cold and frightened and whole, and the radio traffic that followed had none of the crispness of procedure in it, only relief, moving fast between people who had spent the day arguing about a map. Fairbanks tried to put Rufus's name forward that same evening, a formal commendation, something with his name on a plaque, and Rufus turned it down the way he'd turned down every citation offered him across 4 decades, quiet, immediate, no theater in the refusal at all. "Don't need my name on anything," he said. "Never did." What he asked for instead surprised the colonel more than any medal would have, that the old onion skin map and the corrected line drawn from it be kept on file as a standing supplement to the unit's terrain system, not a replacement for it, not buried under it either, just kept, checked, added to whenever the ground itself changed again, the way it always eventually did. It was Kira Sedgwick who came apart in the one specific way nobody watching had predicted. She did not raise her voice or drop her composure all at once. She set the printed run sheet down on the truck hood beside the colonel's cap, and her hands, which had held a hover in bad haze without a tremor an hour before, would not stay still folding that single sheet of paper into quarters. She folded it twice more than it needed, smoothing each crease longer than the crease required, and when she finally looked up at Rufus, her voice had lost every trace of "per the survey." "I trusted the data, because the data's never lied to me before today," she said. "I didn't know to ask what fed it." She looked at the ridge, then back at him. "Will you show me how you read that ground? Not the pencil line, the reading, however long it takes." Rufus considered her the way he considered weather, unhurried, no judgment in it. "Ridge doesn't give it up fast," he said. "Took me most of a war and half a lifetime after." "I've got time," she said, and for the first time all day, she meant it as an offer instead of a schedule. He never asked the ridge to remember him. He only asked to remember it right, and it was that plain arithmetic, more than any citation the colonel could pin to a chest, that finally answered the question the whole crew had been circling since the rotor wash first flattened his hay. Not why he'd kept the map secret, but why a man could carry a whole mountain's true shape in his pocket for 40 years and never once think that made him owed anything for it. The lease vote that had been built on the falsified survey came apart in county chambers 9 days later, once the corrected contour went into the record over Kira Sedgwick's own signature, and the option on that unstable slope died in committee without a single voice raised in its defense. The decommissioning review closed out differently than it had opened too. Her modernization program survived its board vote intact, but folded into its charter a standing manual terrain supplement, unglamorously named for no person and no unit, just a line item that meant a human being still walked certain ground before any screen was trusted to speak for it alone. Rufus never once asked what it was called. He went back to his hay ground the following week, and every week after, and by late autumn the second cutting was in, and the ridge above Coldwater sat quiet under a sky gone the color of skim milk before evening. Colonel Fairbanks came by twice that fall, not on any aircraft, just a truck in the drive and coffee on the porch, with Estelle Hackney fussing over both men the way she'd fussed over every guest in that house for 54 years. And neither man spoke much about the whiteout or the medal that still sat, declined, in a drawer at the regional headquarters. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Rufus finished his last pass on the bush hog as the light went long and copper over the western tree line, throttled down, and climbed off the deck, favoring the same shoulder that had never once, in all these months, learned to rise past his chest. He crossed the cut field on foot, boots quiet in the stubble, and stopped once, the way he always did, to check the sky against the barn roof and judge how much evening he had left before supper. Then he did the other thing he always did, the thing that had outlasted every citation, every review, every ridge dispute the county would ever have again. He reached into his shirt pocket, drew out the onion skin map, gone soft as cloth along its ancient creases, and folded it back along the same 8 lines it had always known, tucking it flat against his heart before walking on. Ahead of him, past the mowed rows and the fence line and the dark shape of the barn, the porch light had already come on, burning small and steady and yellow the way it had every evening for 54 years, whether he was early or late, whether the whole valley had needed him that day or none of it had. Some ground only gives up its true shape to somebody who has walked it in every kind of weather. No instrument yet built can shortcut that kind of knowing. Rufus climbed the porch steps into that same waiting light, and behind him the ridge stood dark and folded and correctly known, exactly as it had always been, exactly as he had always kept it.